Welcome to Let the Record Show, a political history of ACT UP New York, 1987 to 1993, building a world from oral history. This is the second event in our year-long oral history workshop series relating oral history. My name is Carlin Liuzia, and I'm joining you this afternoon from the unceded lands of the Cheyenne and Ute peoples, presently known as Evergreen, Colorado. I help coordinate this series alongside Amy Starachewski, and I also teach the accompanying class here in the Columbia Oral History Master of Arts program. At Columbia, we are in this digital bubble land, still very much situated and dependent on the unceded lands of the Lenape people who were violently dispossessed from the place we now call New York City. And so we're honoring their roots before Columbia's campus and below Columbia's campus, and the strength it has taken to resist and to rebuild both there and elsewhere. And so thank you for kind of lingering in this space at the beginning and taking some time to research where you are as well. As oral historians, we also acknowledge the roots of our practice in Indigenous oral history and the ways in which our field has strategically at times excluded Indigenous people and practices by displacing and repositioning them as merely oral tradition. And there's a lot of really great scholarship out there sort of charting that progression. In particular, we recommend Napia Mahuika's work as a starting place or a continuing place for unlearning and relearning that history. I'll put that title in the chat: Rethinking Oral History and Tradition, an Indigenous Perspective is book. Sorry, that thing is happening again where breathing and speaking aren't coinciding for me this evening. So bear with me. I will do my best here to keep moving along and articulate. Anyway, all that to say, this acknowledging is just the beginning of an ongoing process of building the honoring of Indigenous lands, peoples, knowledges into our practices as oral historians and as humans. There are a lot of great resources, again, in Native Land Digital that you can explore about where you are and continuing to learn more about that. I'd also like to share, as I often do, a poem that I've read recently, and in particular with the themes of tonight's event and New York City, and having lived in New York City and no longer living in New York City. Yeah, I'm losing the thread here. The breathing is not happening. I like to, with land acknowledgements, sort of do them anew every time. I don't want to fall into a place of rote memorization or becoming a chore. So the direction I go is sharing an author who I read and love the work of, and encourage you to explore their work as well. Thank you, Courtney. Tonight I have a poem by Natalie Diaz, who is Mojave and a member of the Gila River Indian Nation. And it's from her collection Post-Colonial Love Poem. And it's about Manhattan and New York and the changes we're seeing in the world and challenges in the world and lots of things. This is not a poetry reading, nor is it about me. So I'm going to read the poem and put it in the chat for you to follow along, and then turn it over to Sarah. I'm going to take a deep breath first. Manhattan is a Lenape word. It is December and we must be brave. The ambulance's rows of light looming against the window, its single siren cry, help me. A silk red shadow unbolting like water through the orchard of her thigh. Her, come, in the green night, a lion. I sleep her bees with my mouth of smoke, dip honey with my hands, stung sweet, on the darksome hive. Out of the eater I eat, meaning she is mine, colony. The things I know aren't easy. I'm the only Native American on the 8th floor of this hotel or any, looking out any window of a turn of the century building in Manhattan. Manhattan is a Lenape word. Even a watch must be wound. How can a century or a heart turn if nobody asks, where have all the natives gone? If you are where you are, then where are those who are not here? Not here. Which is why in this city I have many lovers. All my loves are reparations loves. What is loneliness if not unimaginable light and measured in lumens? An electric bill which must be paid, a taxi cab floating across 3 lanes with its lamp lit, gold in wanting. At 2 a.m., everyone in New York City is empty and asking for someone. Again, the siren's same wide note, help me, meaning I have a gift and it is my body, made two-handed of gauze and bronze. She says, you make me feel like lightning. I say, I don't ever want to make you feel that white. It's too late. I can't stop seeing her bones. I'm counting the carpals, metacarpals of her hand inside me. One bone, the lunate bone, is named for its crescent outline, lunatus, luna. Some nights she rises like that in me, like trouble, a slow, luminous flux. The street lamp beckons the lonely coyote wandering West 29th Street by offering its long wrist of light. The coyote answers by lifting its head and crying stars. Somewhere far from New York City, an American drone finds then loves a body. The radiant nectar it seeks through great darkness makes a candle hour of it and burns gently along it like American touch, an unbearable heat. The siren's song returns in me. I sing it across her throat. Am I what I love? Is this the glittering world I've been begging for? I'll put that in the chat in 2 pieces. That's Manhattan is a Lenape word by Natalie Diaz from Postcolonial Love Poem. And reading it, I thought a lot about New York and this archive and ACT UP and this work. Sarah Schulman has a very extensive and exciting bio that's online and you can find it. She's a writer and a playwright. I encountered her work first through her oral history work and this ACT UP archive, really as one of the first archives that I learned from as an oral history student. So I'm very grateful for everything that she documented and all of the work that she's done in the world. And I'm excited to continue learning from her this evening with you all. Sarah, welcome and thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Zia, and thank you everyone for having me. So I know that your interest is oral history. The first half of my talk is just going to be just setting up the actual history so that you'll have more of a context for understanding how the oral history project unfolded. And I just want to start by saying I started working in the gay and lesbian press and the feminist press in 1979, which is before AIDS was identified. And there is an oral history element or aspect to that press, because this was at a time when every city in this country had at least one gay paper, at least one feminist paper. And there was an entire group of grassroots journalists like myself who were devoted to finding the stories and reporting on our communities for us at a time when mainstream media completely ignored all of our issues, and that's women and queer people. And we worked for free, and we were very devoted, and our papers were not read by mainstream people. They did not have access to our news. They only had access to their own news. So we had their news and our news. So in a way, we had more information. But that's where I started. In '79, I was writing for 3 papers, and then into the early '80s. Woman News, that was a straight and gay feminist newspaper in New York. Gay Community News, that was a lesbian and gay socialist paper out of Boston. And the New York Native, that was the gay male paper out of New York City. And then in 1981 is when science recognized the pattern that became known as AIDS. We now know that AIDS has existed for probably 100 years. It certainly came to the United States around 1940, probably was in New York in the 60s and 70s. But 1981 is when science recognized it. And the first public announcement was July 3rd, 1981 in the New York Times. The article headline was 41 cases of rare cancer found among homosexuals in San Francisco. And I want to contextualize that headline for you so you can really understand the environment into which this event emerged. So in 1981, gay sex was illegal in the United States. It was not transformed federally until 2003 when the Supreme Court through the sodomy law. New York City had no gay rights bill. So you could be kicked out of an apartment, you could be fired from a job, you could be denied public accommodation, refuse service in a restaurant, or refuse service in a hotel in New York City. Familial homophobia was the norm. It was culturally virulent, and street violence, which was a form of entertainment for straight people called gay bashing, was a constant threat, and there was no one to turn to. So it was a period of profound oppression. And this was the moment in which this virus was recognized. Now, I, at the time, was basically covering the fact that there was no gay rights bill in New York City. So I would go to like City Hall, and I would be 21 or something like that, and stand up and say, I guess 23 at that point, Mr. Mayor, Mayor Koch, who was a closeted gay man and no friend of our community, Sarah Schulman, New York native, when are we getting a gay rights bill? And suddenly there was AIDS. And so I began covering or trying to figure out with a small group of people how to cover this crisis. Now, in those first years, the main stories that I covered were pediatric AIDS, which was very significant in New York, where a lot of children were born HIV positive. And then the fact that women were excluded from experimental drug trials. And I just want to explain that a little bit. In the 1960s, there was a drug called thalidomide that was given to pregnant women. And many of them had children who were born without limbs. So there were a lot of suits against pharma, and they had to pay out huge amounts of money in settlements. So at that point on, they did not want women in experimental drug trials. So women were excluded. So that was happening. Homeless people with AIDS was happening. And then there were other community-based issues that I covered, like the first arrests of people with AIDS who were resisting, or when the health department closed the gay male bathhouses. And actually, I was assigned to cover that for the New York Native, which is a very interesting assignment since I had never been in a bathhouse and women were not allowed in the bathhouses. But it shows you how chaotic everything was. You know, reporters were dying, editors were dying, nobody knew what the stories were. It was just very, very chaotic. The first 5 years of the epidemic, 40,000 people died in this country, and the government did absolutely nothing. Pharmaceutical companies basically tried to recycle failed cancer drugs that they owned the patents for. And what they were looking for was like the drug that you would take that would make your AIDS go away. You know, because that would have been a huge market for them. But the way that people with AIDS actually experienced AIDS was very different than that, because AIDS is an umbrella term. It's like cancer. It's different in each person. What it means is that your immune system no longer works. And so as your immune system deteriorates, people who are otherwise healthy and young would develop these horrible symptoms that were called opportunistic infections, like dementia, like blindness, like the inability to process nutrition, skin cancer. The nerves on people's legs would swell. It was a horrible, horrible death filled with suffering. And people with AIDS wanted treatments for each of those opportunistic infections, but that would have been a smaller market share. So pharmaceutical companies did not have the motive to organize their research that way. And the way that the gay community responded in the first 5 years was by trying to create a kind of facsimile of social services for people who were not recognized and who, for many of whom, did not have any kind of family network. So Gay Men's Health Crisis had a Puerto Rican social worker named Diego Lopez who started the buddy system there. He died of AIDS. And that's where people would volunteer. You'd be assigned to a person with AIDS and you would just like visit them. People were very, very isolated who were sick. There was also a lot of stigma about AIDS, or you might like run errands for them or something like that until they died. There was an organization that would walk your dog. There was God's Love We Deliver that would bring nutritious home cooked meals to people's apartments. But the political response did not really start until 1987, 6 years into the epidemic. Now, the events that really turned things were the Supreme Court made a decision in the Bowers v. Hardwick decision that they upheld sodomy laws. And this was a blow to gay people who had been enduring a mass death experience. And now the Supreme Court comes along and says that gay sex should be illegal. People were furious. There were angry demonstrations in the streets in New York and Washington without permits. And there were also some small groups that were political that were responding. A small graphics collective made a poster of an upside down pink triangle against a black background with the words "silence equals death." And they posted this up all over the city. Another group was a ZAP group. ZAPs were a tactic that had been learned from the gay liberation movement. And when you do a ZAP, it really means that you have no investment in the power structure, because it's usually about bursting in and just disrupting everything. And this group was called the Lavender Hill Mob, and they dressed up in concentration camp uniforms and disrupted a meeting of the CDC. But then it was in March of 1987 that ACT UP was actually formed. And this is when the writer Larry Kramer gave a speech at the Lesbian and Gay Center on 13th Street, and the people in the audience decided that they wanted to form an organization. So they met again a few days later, and they came up with the name ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. Now, I just want you to understand how amazingly effective ACT UP actually was. In the 6 years that I cover in my book, 1987 to 1993, ACT UP had phenomenal successes. And let me just tell you some of them. So ACT UP and the rest of the AIDS activist movement basically forced pharmaceutical companies and the government to change the way that they researched treatments so that opportunistic infections became addressed. ACT UP forced the Food and Drug Administration to release experimental drugs that had not been approved of so that people who needed them could get access to them. ACT UP forced Social Security and the CDC to change the definition of what you needed to have to get an AIDS diagnosis so that women with HIV could qualify for benefits and get into experimental treatment and get experimental treatments. And in many ways, this is one of the most far-reaching victories of ACT UP, because today, every woman in the world who's HIV positive and takes a medication is taking something that was tested in part on women. ACT UP made needle exchange legal in New York City. And ACT UP took on the Catholic Church. This was at a time before the priest sex scandal, when the Catholic Church had incredible power in New York City. The cardinal was in office longer than the mayor and had more power than the mayor. And the Catholic Church tried to interfere with the distribution of condoms and needle exchange in the public school system. And ACT UP took them on by disrupting Mass at St. Patrick's Cathedral in December of 1989, which was a turning point in this whole movement. ACT UP also got HIV removed as a pre-existing condition for a private insurance, making about 600,000 people eligible for insurance. But in some ways, the greatest accomplishment was that ACT UP transformed the way queer people and people with AIDS felt about themselves and the ways that we were represented in the media. So those are their really significant victories. Now, what happened was that around 1992, ACT UP had a split in which 12 people left and formed another group called Treatment Action Group. Hundreds of people stayed, but the split was very devastating to the movement. And it also was a period in which no new medications that really worked were discovered. And there was a very rapid and brutal death rate going on in the leadership and in the membership. And even though ACT UP still exists to this day, it started to dissipate. 1996 is when the protease inhibitors were introduced, and this is the beginning of the drugs that worked. the drugs where if you became HIV infected, you could take this medication and have a full lifespan, a normal lifespan. And 1999 is the internet revolution. And this is very important for our concerns because ACT UP was a pre-internet movement. And that means that there was no email. There was no YouTube. When ACT UP would make videos, they would be sent through the mail. People had phone trees. People would travel from city to city and bring news to each other. So when the internet was really popularized at the end of the 20th century, ACT UP's materials were not available because they had not been digitized. And there was a period where you could search ACT UP and find almost nothing. And so we almost disappeared at that point. Now, in 2001, which was the 20th anniversary of the science identifying AIDS in 1981, I was driving in a car and I'm listening to the radio programming about this 20th anniversary. And the guy on the radio said, at first, America had trouble with people with AIDS, but then they came around. And I almost crashed the car. Like I thought, oh no, it's going to be this kind of nightmare where they're just going to pretend that the dominant culture is so benevolent that they just naturally, adopt and do the right thing, which is never true. And the true story was that thousands of people fought until the day they died to force this country to change against its will. And I thought, oh no, what are we going to do? So I called my collaborator, Jim Hubbard. I actually pulled the car over and called him. And we were like, we have to do something. Because many of us who survived this movement, when people were very young, I was in my 20s at the time, and it was very marking to see your friends suffer, in many cases die, in other cases live. And we felt a responsibility to our dead friends who had not been treated correctly by their families or the government and had not been represented accurately. Because one of the things you need to remember is that in the 1980s, the media was almost entirely white and male. The government was almost entirely white and male, and the private sector was almost entirely white and male. So even me as a white lesbian, there was really no one who looked like me in the power apparatus. And so the representations were very meager. So Jim and I decided that we needed to create a database of what happened during ACT UP, what the experience was, and how people won such victories, what the tactics were, how they fought back. So we started the ACT UP Oral History Project in 2001. And you can go to our website, it's actuporalhistory.org. And we have had 14 million hits since we started. And there you will find the full transcripts of all the interviews that we conducted over the next 18 years. It's 188 interviews. I conducted 186 of them. And we have provided free transcripts of every interview. And to date, I think it's about 650,000 of them have been downloaded. So we began this process. Now, the first thing we did was we tried to get money to get a camera and to get software. We estimated that it would cost $25,000 at the time. And we wrote a grant to the Ford Foundation requesting $25,000. What we didn't realize was that the person on the other end receiving the grants was Urvashi Vad, who was a very prominent lesbian leader who was now working in philanthropy. And she knew us from the work that we had done in the street. And she knew that we were people who completed our projects and we were reliable. So she took us under her wing and she was like, rewrite this, say it this way, do this. And we did what she said, and she gave us $300,000. So we had ample funds for starting this project. So we just picked the first person, I believe it was Robert Vasquez, and we interviewed him, and then we just made it that anyone who self-identified as having been in ACT UP New York could be interviewed. We had no criteria. And people who wanted to be interviewed contacted us, and we tried to interview as many people as we could over the next 18 years. Now, of course, that money ran out at some point, but we kept working anyway. So for the most part, we either knew or knew of most of the people that we interviewed. There were a few people that we didn't know who said they wanted to be interviewed, but there was one guy who actually, when we went to his house, he admitted that he had not ever been in ACT UP, but he was a long-term AIDS survivor and he wanted his story to be told. So we said, okay. So we just interviewed him anyway and put it on the website, but everyone else was in ACT UP. So to prepare for this process, we studied 2 Holocaust oral histories systems. One was the Shoah Project run by Steven Spielberg, which is was an enormous project. It had many, many, many people asking questions. The questions were repeated for each interviewee. And the focus of the project was that it arose at a time of Holocaust denialism, which is one of these bizarre movements. It's kind of like what we're dealing with right now in this country, where the people who did the Holocaust acknowledge that they did it. But this was a third-party group of people saying that the Holocaust never occurred. And they were very visible at one point. So the Shoah Project is focused on the moment of atrocity. And we just felt like that did not fit our needs. Because one of the things that we were very interested in trying to find out is what these people had in common. I mean, this was a very effective group of people. And we wanted to really understand what kind of person is able to be so effective to create a paradigm shift. But we were much more interested in a second oral history archive that we looked at that was created by the Fortunoff family, which was a Jewish department store family. And this was housed at Yale. And what they did was that each person that they interviewed, they started with who the person was before the Holocaust and then went through their experiences. And this really appealed to us. So using that as a model, when we first started, we did everything on video, not audio, and I'm so glad we did. And I think it's very important to use video. It's so much richer, the record. But when we first started, video was on these little 40-minute cassettes. So we used the first cassette to talk to the person about who they were before AIDS. And the ulterior motive was to find out, and I had assumptions. I thought, these people must all come from like backgrounds that were community oriented. So there were a lot of questions in the first few years about, did your parents go to church? Did they belong to the PTA? This type of thing. But it didn't pan out. There was nothing that was consistent about people's backgrounds relating to community. Then we shifted to trying to see if people had like dramatic experiences with AIDS that were transforming, that would make them be so committed, because people who were in ACT UP were incredibly effective and incredibly committed. I mean, people did ACT UP all the time. They put their careers on hold. They dropped out of school. But we found that even that, there were people who came to ACT UP who did not know a single person with AIDS. For example, there was a woman who was sitting in her living room in Newark, and she saw ACT UP on television. And the next day she took the New Jersey Transit into the West Village and walked into the gay center and joined ACT UP. So we couldn't correlate. And then in year 8, I interviewed this woman named Rebecca Cole, who at that time was a celebrity urban gardener, but she had been in ACT UP. And she told me the following story, and this was like a turning point for me. She was an actress who had come to New York. She was working in a bar, and somebody came into the bar and said, they're hiring people to work on an AIDS hotline, and they're paying $10 an hour, and she needed $10 an hour. So she took the job. She got to the AIDS hotline and nobody had any information, because this was at a time that was so early in the AIDS crisis that people didn't even know how AIDS was transmitted. There were no treatments. So people were calling with crazy questions, like if a person has AIDS and they serve a hamburger and I eat that hamburger, can I get AIDS? These types of questions. And anything about treatments, the people answering the AIDS hotline didn't know the answers. So it was this kind of random thing with actors answering the phone. Anyway, one day a woman called her from Connecticut and said, I have AIDS and I tried to get into this experimental trial near me and they said women weren't allowed. And Rebecca thought, what? So she started calling around and she found out that no one allowed women. And she was so outraged that she called the CDC, made an appointment, and with another friend of hers traveled and told them that women with AIDS were being excluded from trials. And this is the beginning of the solidarity movement with women with HIV. And when she told me that story, I thought, oh, I get it. What these people have in common is not experiential, it's characterological. It's a kind of person who cannot stand by and be a bystander. And that took 8 years for us to figure out. Anyway, we compiled all of this data. We made it available for free. I went around the country sharing it with universities, hoping that people would use it. Our idea was that we would make this data available and academics or somebody would use it and analyze it and whatever. But the years started to pass and they really didn't. What we found was that people would search like the keyword of what they were looking for, but they wouldn't actually read the whole transcript, so they would miss so much. And of course, because we were conducting the interviews, we knew how rich they were and we knew how much was in there. The other thing that was happening is that Jim Hubbard, my collaborator, is a filmmaker, and during this time, he was collecting footage. So just to give you the context, when AIDS first started, there was no technology for recording off of a television set. People were using 16mm film cameras and Super 8 film cameras and literally filming the TV screen. Then came beta video, which was you needed 2 people. One person would carry this huge deck that was the size of a big suitcase, and the other person would carry a boom mic and hold it over the person who was speaking. And that's how you recorded video. And then the camcorder was invented. So ACT UP was the first movement to have, mobile video and invented video activism. But Jim was collecting all of this footage because people would be like, my boyfriend died, he left these 2 reels of Super 8, I don't know what to do with them, whatever. And he ended up amassing a collection of about 2,000 hours of archival footage, including 700 hours that were shot by one artist, James Wency. And Jim digitized all of this. So if you look at his film that he made in 2012, United in Anger, you could see that there's kind of a dreamy surface texture quality because all the footage was digitized. So we accrued all of this footage on top of all of these interviews and nobody was doing anything with them. And Jim decided that he wanted to make a film. So we had the mixture of the interviews and the archival footage, and we went looking for money. Well, we found that documentary funders had very strict ideas about how a documentary should be constructed, in that they wanted it to be about 5 characters on a journey. And now if you look at most, funded American documentaries, that's what they are. But we couldn't do that because that would have been inaccurate. Because the thing about ACT UP was it had so many different kinds of people doing so many different kinds of things at the same time that to reduce it to 5 people would have not only been untrue, but would have been impossible. So we could not get any film money. We did get social justice money, and we also had 400 individual donors, all of whose names are at the end of the film. And then in the end, we sold the archive, the oral history archive, to the Harvard Library for $500,000, and all that money went into making the feature film. So we released the feature film in 2012, and we literally took the film around the world. So we showed it in Palestine, Lebanon, Abu Dhabi, Brazil, India. We showed it in Russia right after the anti-gay laws were passed. We showed it to people with AIDS all over the world. But something else was happening at that period, which is that there was another revisionism that was occurring, which was other films and other works started to come out that had the 5 characters. And this image started to come across that, was a handful of white people, mostly men. These individuals were the ones who did everything. And it was so distorting. It was so upsetting. I remember I wrote an article about ACT UP for the New York Times T magazine, and the gay editor corrected when I wrote ACT UP, he changed it to Larry Kramer's ACT UP. And I was like, no, that is inaccurate. So people were trying to shove ACT UP into this John Wayne American myth, rugged white individual that saves the day, which never was true and can't be true, but into that myth, which is very comforting. And works that did that were getting highly rewarded. So we became very, very frustrated, and we started to look for somebody to write a book using all this incredible material that we had accrued, and we couldn't find anybody. So we finally decided that I would do it. So I took 3 years and reread all of the interviews and started to cohere tropes that emerged. And most importantly, you know, the thing that started to become clear to me is that this story could not be told chronologically because so many things happened at the same time, and that instead it had to be told thematically. And what emerged was how ACT UP did it, which is, you know, activist information is very hard to access. Usually mainstream media records are very distorted, and that it certainly is true for ACT UP. And we learned a lot of things, and I'm just going to share some of them with you as I close. So some of the big takeaways from all these years of oral history and really studying the transcripts are that, first of all, ACT UP was not a consensus-based movement. It was a movement that allowed for a lot of divergent thinking, but there was a bottom line of collective value, and that was a one-line statement of unity: direct action to end the AIDS crisis. And that was as opposed to social service provision. But basically, if you were doing direct action to end the AIDS crisis and you had an idea, you could do it. But the great thing about ACT UP was that people didn't have to agree with each other to be able to do their idea. So for example, needle exchange. At the time, sharing needles was a very common way that people got infected with HIV in New York City. And at this point, there was a Black mayor, David Dinkins. The ideas about harm reduction were brand new, and people were suspicious of them. The old idea was abstinence, which we now know doesn't work, and we know that harm reduction does, but that was not known at the time. And the Black community was very ambivalent about harm reduction, and Dinkins did not support needle exchange. And there were people in ACT UP who did not support needle exchange. But when the Needle Exchange Committee started, which was started by former and active drug users, if people didn't agree with it, they would argue, because we argued very much. ACT UP was a pre-gentrification New York organization where there was a lot of confrontation. But in the end, the people who didn't believe in needle exchange just didn't work on it. And the people who did, they worked on it. And the people who wanted to do something else, they created that. And so there was a simultaneity of action and radical democracy in the organization that created a kind of big tent politic in which people could work together without having to agree. And this is very, very effective. I think historically, movements where people are forced to, or they try to force each other to agree on one analysis or one strategy, those always fail. And movements that have radical democracy are the ones that are more likely to be effective. So that's one of the really big takeaways from the Oral History Project and from ACT UP. And my book came out in May. It's 750 pages, but I'm a novelist, so I think it's kind of readable. And it's been interesting that people have been very interested in it and really responded to it, except for the very small group of people who really wanted to be that those 5 guys did everything. And there's an investment, not just by some of them, but also by some of the men who are still gatekeepers and controlling the discourse. They still love that idea. And they're very angry that we also mentioned, because those people did a very important work, and their work is appreciated and respected in the book. But we also, I talk about 140 people in the book who are working in all kinds of realms. And there's anger about that, about taking away that kind of hero status and saying, look, all these other people did this work too. And that's been, you know, that's been an interesting response. So that's where I'm at, and I'm very interested in your questions and comments. And thank you so much for listening.
I miss the sound of clapping, actually, if I may say. I like when the screen does this, but I miss the sound. Sarah, thank you so much for sharing that that story and that history, and for all the work that you've done. I think I was realizing as this was going on, that I think part of my breathing and speaking and difficulty earlier was just that I have a lot of feelings about this work as a young queer person. And I'm very grateful for everything that you did as part of ACT UP and for everything that you've done since to document that work and that gift to us all. So thank you. Feel free to chime in, folks, with questions in the chat. I have lots. I know the class has lots as well that we didn't have time for in the class session before this. You can also feel free, we're a pretty small enough group that feel free to unmute as well and share your questions out loud if you would rather. I know sometimes forming a question can take some time too, so it's okay if we kind of pause and do some thinking and formulating. But Sarah, thank you so much. Sarah, Ava has asked a question in the chat, writing a senior thesis on ACT UP. And oh, wait, a different one came in. Sorry, I was looking at Elisas' question first and then it jumped. Elisas' question contextualizes, I was peripherally involved with ACT UP in Chicago. Do you know if there were big differences among chapters in different cities?
They were all extremely different. New York was the mothership. It was the first chapter, but it was not, I mean, although sometimes the chapters cooperated with each other, such as the action at the Food and Drug Administration, it was not a nationalized movement. People responded locally to the culture of where they were. There were 148 chapters around the world and to the needs of their particular area. For example, at that time, the experience of people with AIDS in San Francisco and New York were dramatically different. It was like two different countries. I had a friend who was dying in San Francisco, and I remember like when he would go to the hospital, they had a special triage entry system for people with AIDS. They called him after he left to find out how he was. He could ride the buses for free. He had a discount at the Rainbow Food Co-op. New York, people were dying on gurneys in hallways, and the mayor was antagonistic to the community. So it was really different because there were different conditions for gay people in every different city and state and country, and also because of, you know, we didn't have a healthcare system in the United States. So people in other countries who had a healthcare system had a completely different set of issues. But one way that New York did interact with the other chapters is that ACT UP was a political movement. It was not a 501c3. It was not a not-for-profit. And so the fundraising came from the community, not from grants or anything like that. And the first way that ACT UP raised money was by selling t-shirts. It had very advanced graphics and really startling images. And the first day they sold t-shirts, they sold $30,000 worth of t-shirts. So ACT UP could send t-shirts to local chapters and they could sell that merchandise to raise money for themselves. But they were very, very independent.
Thank you. Ava has a question about potentially interviewing you, so I'll try to connect you two afterwards as well. Amy, fine. I see your hand raised thing. You want to chime in with a question?
Sure. I thank you so much, Sarah, for this work. I really learned so much from reading it. I have a bunch of questions, but maybe I'll start just noticing that the book, one of the things I really liked about the book is that it felt so rigorous. Like the stakes feel really high for like really understanding what happened and how it happened, but not like in a abstract academic sense, but in the sense that like having this knowledge really matters to real people and for the world. And my sense is that part of that, audience that this matters to is activists now, and that you're sort of trying to convey lessons learned so that people can make use of them in doing organizing work now. And I'm just curious about like how that, if I'm correct in imagining that that's part of your goal, like how that has been, because I think there are real challenges to transmitting knowledge from one generation of activists to another, and also real potentials.
For both the film and the book, our goal was absolutely not nostalgia. We were entirely interested in conveying hard-won information to activists today that they can use. However, we are in no way saying you should do it this way, you have to do it this way, this is the way to do it. We're just giving information about what worked and why in its context so that people can have a little more information and as to how they make decisions. Like I know when I read, one of the books that my book is based on is Crossing the Water by Taylor Branch, which is also a mammoth book where he interviewed rank and file people from the civil rights movement. And I remember reading in that book and learning that Rosa Parks, who I had been told was a woman who was tired after work and decided that she wanted to sit down in the whites only section of the bus, that actually she was a member of the NAACP and she was sent in to do that direct action, even though the public image was so different. And learning that, those kinds of strategies, how strategic previous movements have been, was really important for us. So I'm just hoping that this information will convey as well.
Thank you, Sarah, for that question, Amy. Kay's question in the chat actually, I think, ties into that really well. Kay asks, Sarah, I'm curious to hear about other young queer people's responses to the documentary and the book. What are younger people saying, if anything, and how do you feel about any intergenerational interactions you've had around this work?
Well, it's, we've been doing
that they were born in 1993.
I mean, we started in 2001. First of all, I've been writing about AIDS since AIDS began. Right. So when I started writing about it, I was the young person and I've been writing about it my whole life, because I'm that generation. But we started doing the Oral History Project in 2001 and started taking the material around immediately. And so it's not just younger people, it's also people in other nations. When the first Gulf War started, ACT UP had interrupted the Dan Rather news program on television saying, fight AIDS, not Arabs. And when we showed the film in Lebanon, Abu Dhabi, and Palestine, Arab people in another part of the world got to see that people with AIDS in America were saying, fight AIDS, not Arabs. And that's something that they had not known because, so there's so many different kinds of difference that this information transcends, but there are people with AIDS everywhere and in every age group, so people with HIV. So like when we went to Russia, right after the anti-gay laws were passed, that was a fascinating experience because there was at the time really a separate gay AIDS movement and a straight AIDS movement because it's a place where most people with HIV at that time had been drug users instead of it being sexually transmitted. And so, we asked people like, well, what do you think about these anti-gay laws? And they're like, yeah, Putin's a bad father, but they're going to have to leave. And then we're like, wow, we're dealing with like homophobic people with AIDS. That's a whole new thing that I had not been experienced before. So there's just been a lot of difference in all of this work. And of course, there are young people today who are HIV positive. Let us not forget.
Thanks, Sarah. Alexa has a question in here. As a longtime movement activist, I'm fascinated by your analysis and particularly your embrace of a broad movement story as opposed to a hero-oriented story. Love this 2-sentence format question here, Alexa. Do you think of your perspective on the movement is feminist or specific to your experience as a woman outside established power structures?
I just think it's from being an artist, to be honest. I mean, I'm primarily a novelist, right? This whole thing is a detour. And it's all because I've been just responding to crises, they needed documentation, the wrong story was coming out, that kind of thing. But as a novelist, your job is to convey how characters experience their own lives, not how you wish they would experience it or how you think they should experience it, but how they actually do. And that's been my training from the beginning. And I wasn't trained. I mean, I evolved organically as a writer, but that's my orientation. And I brought that to everything that I've done. So I think that, the complexity is where the enlightenment is.
Eliza, I think I said Eliza earlier. Eliza has another question. How did you deal with the history of a group where so many leaders died and could not be interviewed?
Yeah, so, that's hard to account for, and especially because almost every woman with HIV who was in ACT UP died. Women tended to be poorer, they were diagnosed later, they couldn't get access to services, and so that's like a huge void. In our film, United in Anger, you can see footage of some of the women leaders of the Women with HIV movement. People like Katrina Haslip, who was an incarcerated woman at Bedford Hills, who became a phenomenal leader. And her story is quite amazing. And I tried to recreate that from third-party memory and testimony. We have footage of Phyllis Sharp, who was a woman who was often homeless and drug user, who was one of the people who sued Social Security. And we see her giving speeches at rallies. Iris Dela Cruz from Prostitutes of New York, who had a column in the People with AIDS newsletter called Iris with the Virus. And she died at 38. We have footage of her at a demonstration. So tried to, using what we had, convey. And often, when I would interview people, I would ask, who do you want to talk about? But of course, I have my own memories as well.
Amy has a follow-up on that. Have you heard anything about how activists are using the book or the archive or the history? So follow up on earlier question and the last question.
I mean, so many people are using it. Like I said, we've had 14 million hits. The fact that 650,000 people have downloaded transcripts, I mean, that they needed to have paper of a transcript that is available online, it, to me, tells me that people are using it. And we get requests all the time from people asking to cite things. And we also always say, yes, it's all open access. So it's out there. It's just been out there for a long time, and I hope it will become part of the conversation.
Thanks. Lynn has a question, and I saw Lynn with a lot of knowing nods during your presentation about sort of this era of organizing and many similarities, I'm sure. Lynn's question, were there tensions for you between being a member of a group, sharing oral histories of other members while you were also a member, and determining what is your analysis and what is perhaps a collective ACT UP analysis? And the second part, how was it for you navigating all of those complexities and others that Lynn didn't name?
Well, so when I realized that I was going to have to write this book that I did not want to write, Jim and I really took stock of the fact that 188 people had trusted us. I had this material. This was not going to be my memoir of ACT UP. I had to let people speak for themselves. And I gave people a lot of space. I made the decision that I'm going to be fair. There are people in that book who I don't like, and I don't think you could tell which ones they are, and who are saying things that I don't agree with, and sometimes things that I don't even think are true. But I just let them say it. And I just went with it. And that's the way it is. And interestingly, there are people who, if someone says something that they don't like, they blame me and think that it's my point of view, but it's not. I was not involved. I mean, I was in ACT UP when it split, but the fighting was really between like a small group of people. So hundreds of us were sitting in the upper seats in Cooper Union watching like 25 or 30 people tear each other to shreds. And most people in ACT UP were not even participating in the split. They were just watching everything fall apart. And I was one of those people. So I wasn't on either side or any side, and I didn't have any position. But there are people who assume that I did because it's represented in a way that it hadn't been represented before. And I think the fact that material has now been available for almost 20 years, to me means that at this point, it is not appropriate for anyone to be writing a history of that time that cannot accurately represent points of view that they don't share. because those points of view are so available. All you have to do is click. So.
Thanks, Sarah. Bridget has a question, I think along those lines, actually. You spoke about how ACT UP wasn't consensus-based and allowed for divergent thinking. Nowadays, there tends to be more homogeneity in movement groups. Bridget says, I know you've also researched and written about gentrification. I'm curious if you see any connection between this tendency and gentrification.
Well, my book is called The Gentrification of the Mind. So I think the answer is yes. And what I argue is that, you know, when a city gets homogenized, it changes the way people think. Because the reason that cities and that urbanity produce new ideas for the world, new political ideas, new art ideas, is because when a city is healthy, it's a place of incredible difference. And you're constantly exposed to difference, and you're constantly reminded every single day of your life that other people are different than you and have other points of view. And this mix is what produces so many exciting ideas. When you gentrify a city, you are homogenizing over that mix. And so people are not exposed to difference in the same way. And cities cannot produce new ideas in the same way. So absolutely.
I have a question. Others, you know, feel free to keep brainstorming and adding stuff to the chat. But you mentioned this, you kind of sort of alluded to this, Sarah, in the class earlier. You talked about it a little bit, but I'm curious sort of what interviewing background you came, I mean, journalism for sure, but what like oral history style interviewing you came to work on this project with, and how it, or if you came with none, like how you grew that, how your style changed over the course of this project.
I had none. I had no training whatsoever. I was, like I said, a grassroots journalist for many years, and I did interview many people. But I just am like a real New Yorker, you know, and of the old school. And I'm one of those, you know, put it on the table and say what's really happening people, which used to be the New York style. And that is what happened. But no, I had absolutely no training. I also have never been to graduate school either. So it's just from the grassroots.
I'm not sure quite what the shape of this question is yet, but this project and this archive and this work has been such a huge part of your life and career for so long. I'm curious, do you still feel as though you have like creative energy around this work and this project, or you have creative energy elsewhere?
The funny thing is that this is not my main work. This has been like a side thing, but to be really, I mean, because I'm a novelist primarily, and I write plays, and I write a lot of, I've written many novels. For 37 years, I've been a novelist, mostly with lesbian characters. The reason this work has stood out is because I think it's because it's about men. And so it's treated like it's more important. And, you know, work with lesbian protagonists is not treated as important. It's more marginalized. And so this has taken a lopsided amount of space. Because, you know, like this, my last book came out and suddenly people are like, oh my God, you're such a good writer. Oh, you're so smart, you know, because it's about men. And I really think that that's why it has this kind of light shining on it. But actually, no, I'm really a novelist, mostly about lesbian life.
I love that. Thank you for that. Yeah. That's fascinating. Elisa has a process question back to the book, though now I want to ask all about that. Elisa's question though is, what was your process for shaping the 171 interviews into a book?
Yeah, so when I started rereading the transcripts, the first thing I realized was that the story could not be told chronologically because so many things happened at the same time. So I started sort of cohering tropes. So like, for example, somebody would say, I was hanging out at the center on a Monday and I saw those people in a room and I thought, what are they doing over there? Or somebody else would say, I was going to the center to get my health care and there was an ACT UP meeting, so I thought I'd drop by. You know, and I started to see this being repeated and I realized, oh, if you hold your meetings in a place, a space that the community already trusts and already goes to and already identifies with, then you're more likely to attract the community. So that was something that I like cohered from the evidence. Nobody said that, but it became evident. So I was looking for all kinds of things like that. What was revealed by putting all of these interviews together? And that's how I pulled out what the strategies were. Like, for example, one of the really interesting things about ACT UP, okay, it was primarily a gay white male organization, but there were women and people of color in the group. Now, what's interesting is the way that they functioned in ACT UP was women and people of color never stopped the action to demand consciousness raising or to call people out for racism and sexism or whatever. What they did instead was something very, I think, inspiring, which is that they had really effective agendas to build for their communities, and they simply marshaled the very ample resources of this white gay male organization for their constituencies. So, for example, ACT UP had some very elite members, and they were able to organize an art auction that raised $650,000. So when the Latino caucus saw that people with AIDS in Puerto Rico really needed support, they just went to fundraising and got the money and went to Puerto Rico and started ACT UP Puerto Rico. When the women with HIV needed to travel to testify at hearings or go to demonstrations, and they needed to stay in hotels, they just went to fundraising and got the money and funded it. So it was just like, keep your eye on your prize and keep moving forward. And one of the leaders of ACT UP, Maxine Wolf, would say that if you go action first, your theory will emerge. You know, ACT UP did not waste time arguing theoretical questions. Everything was action oriented because that's what people needed. But when you're doing an action, you have to make decisions about how to do it. And in order to make those decisions, you have to realize what your values are. And that's how the theory would emerge. So there was no stopping the action. And I think we can learn a lot from that.
Lynn asks, did you find that action was also healing?
That's not my vocabulary. I'm sorry. It's certainly, you know, action is what saved people's lives. There's probably people in this chat who are alive today because of those actions. And that's more how I look at it.
Can I ask a question?
Please.
And thank you so much for like sharing this beautiful story of this project. It's a follow-up question to Carlin's question, and about how it sounds to me that there's this moment of entering the world and this universe of stories and then exiting it. Since you mentioned that you were doing this as a side project, right? And how it has been this side project that has be part of your life over the course of kind of like more than a decade. So can you talk a little bit more about that entering and exiting, that movement that I imagine you had to be doing as you were working on your other novels and writing projects, and then you have to re-engage with these voices and these stories for working on this book?
Well, usually I'm able to do a lot of things at the same time just because of the way that I work. Like, I'm very natural as a writer. It comes to me really easily. So I experience it almost as neurological. I've been writing since I was 6 years old. So it's not like this strain. And so doing this big book, I mean, there's other things I would have rather been doing, but it had to be done. It's that type of thing. There's a very strong sense of responsibility to our dead friends, and Jim Hubbard and I share that because they're not here, and they were abandoned by their families and by the government, and they suffered and died, and we're here. And so, and maybe it's because I'm Jewish and I was born mid-20th century and I come from a Holocaust family, but I have this very strong sense of being responsible for making sure that a story gets told, you know, but that's not my artistic impulse. That's just like what you have to do. So that's more about how I think about it.
Did you have a process, Sarah, for re-interviewing it all, or running drafts of the theme pieces that you were working on
No,
with narrators you still had access to?
No, we would post the transcript. And if the person wanted to amend it, they could put an addenda at the end, but they could not remove anything. Like, for example, there was one person who revealed in their interview that they had been a police officer, and other people did not know that about them. And they wanted it removed. And we said, no, you cannot remove that. But if you want to qualify it, you can add something. So that's how we did it.
And then in terms of the writing, the book version of the curation.
Well, it's almost all verbatim. I mean, most of the narrative is really just paraphrase. There's some of the, when the narrative is me, you totally know it. But most of it is really just paraphrased from the interviews, because originally the first draft was just big blocks of interview and the editor was like, no, you have to paraphrase.
Thanks. Alexa has a question. What do you think the legacy of ACT UP lives on or not in the LGBTQI community today?
I don't even know what that community is, because it seems to me that each of those letters is having a very distinctly different experience at the moment. So I kind of feel like it's a false category. I do think that when the campaign for gay marriage was underway, they really strategically separated AIDS from gay. And because if you saw at that time, if you recall, there was a lot of like poster couples, you know, we've been together for 50 million years and we need the right to get married. And that person would never say, I'm HIV positive, never. And there was this kind of message in the gay marriage movement, like that marriage was monogamous and marriage was going to stop gay male sexuality, which is gay male sexual culture, which is associated with AIDS. And so there was this like division that occurred. It was a kind of propaganda division. And since then, I think that AIDS and gay have been separated in the public mind, even though most people who get infected now are young gay men of color. Linda Villarosa, who's this kind of genius journalist at the New York Times, had a cover story in 2017 that I highly recommend, where she showed that Black gay men in the US South have higher rates of infection than any country in the world right now. So it is still within gay people, gay men, but it's men of color. And that this separation has removed it from the public, unless you're looking at ads for AIDS drugs on television, then you will see men of color or trans people of color in those ads.
Thanks for that analysis. Charlie has a question. You talked about reporting on AIDS for a number of years before joining ACT UP. What was your impetus for joining when you did? And what was it like transitioning from being a journalist to being a member?
Well, I never transitioned. I kept writing the whole time, but I had been in the reproductive rights movement in the late 70s after the Hyde Amendment. So just to give history, abortion became legal in New York City in 71. It became legal nationally in 73. From 73 to 79, anyone who needed an abortion could get it paid by Medicaid. But in 79, there was the Hyde Amendment, which took away Medicaid funding. And since 1979, in many places in this country, abortion has not been available unless you could pay or travel. Right. And at that point in 79, when I was 21, I became involved in the reproductive rights movement. And I went through an experience in the early 80s of a lesbian purge in a reproductive rights group. And there were a number, you know, what's interesting is the gay movement existed as an autonomous movement because earlier progressive movements did not want gay people. The Communist Party expelled gay men. The civil rights movement famously sidelined Bayard Rustin. The feminist movement had a number of lesbian purges, some of which have not been written about. And so queer people were the people that nobody else wanted to work with. And I had gone through that experience, and it was a horrible experience. And so I came to ACT UP because other women that I knew who had gone through that experience were telling me that ACT UP was a good place. And I had been covering AIDS anyway. So ACT UP was founded in March of '87, and I joined in July of '87. And the thing about being in ACT UP was you were never going to be kicked out for being gay, that was for sure. And also, many of the women who came in had been active in the feminist movement or the reproductive rights movement, the feminist women's health movement, the women's peace movement, and had all of this organizing experience that most of the men didn't have. The older gay men had been in gay liberation. And some of the Latino gay men had come from that. This was the time of fascist dictatorships in Argentina and Chile, and there were a lot of exiles in New York, and there were Latinos in ACT UP who had come from those places, so they were politicized. But the younger white gay men, for the most part, had never been politically active, and they were very open to our experience, and they treated us with respect, and they learned from those movements because they were desperate, and they needed to win. And so that was a very positive environment, and it was very exciting. I also, having been in the women's movement, had never been in a movement that was rich before. You know, in the women's movement, nobody had any money, and everything was, you had to string everything together. ACT UP was able to really raise money, real money, and that was very exciting also.
Thank you for that. I've been curious about that as well, Charlie. Thank you for asking that. Lisa has a question pointing out that it says in the event listing that this book has been optioned as a TV series.
Right.
Can you talk about how that works? Will you have any input? And how do you feel about handing it off or not?
Yeah, so it was optioned by Christine Vachon, who many of you may have heard of. She runs Killer Films, and she's the person who's produced all the Todd Haynes movies and movies like Carol and all of that. And she was in ACT UP. So the fact that a lesbian who was in ACT UP, who's an extremely experienced producer of queer and lesbian and AIDS media, is the person who optioned it, I really don't think I could do any better than that, to be really honest. And she brought in this other company called Concordia, and they did the television series based on the Central Park 5 story. And they did Spotlight, the story about priest abuse in Boston. So they also have a very good record. And they hired a writer named Andrew Haig, who is a gay man with a very classy background. He did a movie called 45 Years with Charlotte Rampling. He did a TV series called Looking that was gay men in San Francisco. And he's a very smart guy, and he's writing the pitch. So they're trying to sell it. I am not involved in that. So I'm not a writer on the show. I'm the source material person. And that's where we are. It hasn't been sold yet. It may never be sold, but maybe it will be. And the idea is a dramatic series. But it's a very good team. It's really people with very, very good track records of doing things that are social justice oriented and also interesting to watch.
I would watch. I'll watch. Everyone who's here, I think, will watch. Lisa says good luck.
It's interesting because people say, who do you want to have in it? And I'm like, well, everyone has to be in their 20s. So I don't even know who the actors are who are 23 or whatever. No.
Totally. We're coming close down to time here, gang. So if you have last questions, please feel free to unmute and ask them or share them in the chat. Yeah, I think my questions are gonna form tonight or tomorrow. Yeah, Eliza, do you want to ask a question out loud? I see your hand.
Sure, Elisa.
Eliza, it is. Okay.
Yeah, no, I was just because I keep thinking back to that time. I mean, the thing that made it so unique, and again, my experience was in Chicago, is people were facing death. I mean, this was, and you were like 25 or 30, and it was just, I mean, when I think back to that time, it was just so overwhelming that you're losing all these friends that are your age. And how do you convey that? Because I don't know, that's what stands out for me. And I wasn't in New York.
It's very hard. It's much easier to convey the heroism than it is to convey the suffering. And that was something we learned from the film. We felt like people did not understand the suffering after they saw the film. So in my book, I really try to convey the suffering. I detailed what AIDS is like, what people go through. I kept in all the testimony about the hardships that people went through physically and emotionally. Also, the generation of men who survived that period have had a lot of trouble. A lot of those guys have had crystal meth problems, have seroconverted late in life. They have not been taken care of. And, I put that out there. The book ends with an interview with this guy, Cesar Carrasco from the Latino caucus, who's now a psychiatric social worker. And he talks about the myth of resilience and this idea that if you lived, you survived is not necessarily true. That first generation, what do we owe them and what are they going through? So I really tried to be accountable to all of that.
Thanks for that, Elisa. Especially in sort of focused events like this and focused conversations like this, but sometimes not randomly, but activated by surprises. I remember physically in my body, I'm in the space of when I watched the film for the first time and the scene in St. Patrick's Cathedral, the "you're killing me, stop it," that scene lives in my body. And so I don't know, I share that to let you know that you and Jim have done that, I think, really, really well and really beautifully, conveyed that, whether or not, everyone is able to receive it or when, but you've really, you have done the work to convey that to a younger generation, I would say. And we all really appreciate it and have learned so much from you this evening and across all of your work. Thank you so much, everyone who's here, for being here, and Sarah for everything you've done. Read on, watch the film. If you haven't seen the film yet, watch the film as well, and read on and share. Our next event is going to be next week, Thursday, October 28th. Actually, Maria Islas Lopez is here this evening, which is wonderful. She'll be presenting with a team from History Colorado and Centro Humanitario. That event is called Making Meaning Through Relationality in an Oral History Project, Amplifying Latino Immigrant Workers' Voices in the Pandemic. So I hope that many of you can join us again next week for that event. And thank you again so much.
Good night.